the pacing strategy of 100 miles as a sentence seems logical. But when that's sub 7 minute mile pace, my brain starts to melt a little bit. So talk us through, if you were going for a best effort 100 miler, let's say you had 6 months of prep and you were planning your 6 months out now. As you've already said, you'd have a lot of your harder effort interval stuff early on. You'd probably focus on more tempo, sub-threshold stuff in blocks in the middle, and then it'd just be pacing specific stuff towards the end. And that pacing specific stuff, I assume, would just be drilling the pace range that you want to be operating in when it came to race day itself. But how would you manage race day? Do you break it up into chunks where you're going to be working in this range? Do you say, I'm going to start at this pace and hold it for as long as I can and then default to this range? How do you break it down?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is probably one of the biggest shifts I've had in my strategy over my career in terms of how I go about like a race like this. So I think like early on, I think a lot of ultralists still prescribe to this, and, you know, who knows, maybe they're right. We probably don't know enough about. I just tend to think that based on what we know from other endurance sports, this approach probably maps more accurately, which is like the closer you can get to an even split, the better. So like maybe that's a percentage point or two on either side of even. That is kind of like a good loading zone or an operating zone that's not going to necessarily like get you into a position where you're giving back more time than you gain because you went out too fast like I did in 2015, or get out too slow and then you find yourself at the end thinking, had I gone a little faster early on, I would have finished sooner, and I just didn't have like, you know, the speed to kind of eat up that margin by the end. I think that's probably like a couple percentage points. So the way I'll usually strategize is I'll pick a time that I'm targeting kind of based on where I think my fitness is at, based for comparatively to historical points. And then from that time, I just kind of start reverse engineering kind of the pace that would be required. Then I try to build it out in a way where there's like an aggressive, a moderate, and a conservative pace, where the conservative is going to be, this is the slowest I can likely go and still feel confident that if things go really well, I'll be able to speed up enough at the end and potentially run a negative split to the degree where I won't be in that situation where I'm thinking, all right, well, I went out too slow and that costed me too much. The aggressive side is going to be like, this is the fastest I can likely produce for this day. Anything faster is probably going to cost me time on the back end if I find myself running faster than this in the early stages of the race. And then the middle is just going to probably be that kind of goal time, that more like general target, more or less. And I'm going to try to be kind of in that zone the whole time. And the way I usually do it on these track events is I'll look at what that plays out to from like a lap split standpoint. And every time you go around the loop, usually it's 400 meters, but some tracks are different sizes, you'll get to see that split of how fast you did that loop. So I've got a range usually there, and then I'll spot check that occasionally and just make sure I'm in.
What is that range? What would it be at that pace?
So if it's on a 400 meter track and you look at just like my 100 mile best, we're looking at, would that be a minute and 40 seconds roughly would be like a good, would be a good kind of split. My average pace of 6:47 is probably, in terms of moving time, is probably closer to 6:40, because you have, I think when I ran 11:19 with the 6:47, I think I stopped 3 times for maybe a total of 2 or 3 minutes. And then you are on the track with people doing longer duration things. So you find yourself in lane 2, sometimes lane 3. So you probably are running closer to, let's say, 101 plus miles at the end of the day. So from a moving pace standpoint, you have to be moving quicker than what the pace actually shows up on paper. But in terms of how that gets reported to me on the race itself, it's going to be specific to the tightest part on the track. So that's the number I'm measuring. Yeah. And like a minute 40 is going to get me to a spot that's going to be about a 6:40 minute mile pace. So I'm going to likely be like, for that particular day, I was kind of building around that because that was around where I was projecting myself to be able to finish for a good day.
So if you saw a 137, would you inherently pull back a little bit? And conversely, if you saw a 148 that felt like the same rate of perceived exertion as a 140 should, you'd then start to think ahead and plan ahead as to how you were going to manage the rest of the strategy based on how far you had remaining.
Yeah. And Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And like the way I look at it is like the easy one to course correct is when you're going too fast because you just slow down. When you're going too slow and the effort feels appropriate or maybe even aggressive, you have to ask yourself, did I mismanage my goals? And if I mismanage my goals, is putting myself back within that operating zone going to actually do the thing I'm trying to avoid, which is running slower than I anticipated? So that's always kind of like the bit of uncertainty, because we are, I've done these before, so I have some precedent. I've had really good training buildups, and I've been able to map them to a degree where like I can probably expect to be in a specific fitness state where I can rule out a certain pace being too aggressive versus appropriate, and narrow down like how much thought I have to give if I'm actually overshooting or not. But at the end of the day, you're always a different person when you step on a start line from the time before, and you are reaching back to prior experiences. So there is that little bit of doubt when you find yourself running slow as to whether you're just in a low patch that you need to get out of or you're overshooting your potential.